Good morning. My name is Cecily Raynor, and I'm an assistant professor of Digital Humanities and Hispanic Studies at McGill University. Today, I will be talking about absences and discuss the potential future of e-lit in the spaces of national newspapers in Chile and Argentina. I will be focusing specifically on the arts and culture section of Argentina's national newspaper, La Nación, as well as Chile's Culto, its companion site, which is dedicated to arts and culture. Three main questions fuel this presentation. Number one, how do we explain the dearth of digitally born literature and e-lit in national newspapers in Latin America? Number two, what contradictions might emerge in the spaces of national literature, given their frequent link to canonical conceptions of literature? And finally, what happens when digitally born literature is the primary mode of production in an era when analog distribution is a logistical impossibility? How might we rethink what it means to be a writer of e-lit? Digital newspapers face challenges that arise at the tension between the need to sustain an active online readership given broadly decreased print circulations and advertising revenues. We can look to Patterson and Domingo in 2008 for more on this. And the contested territory of the web is a transnational and multinational space, whereas newspapers have historically been understood in terms of national circulation. In this slide, I wanted to highlight traffic patterns across the sites. If we look at La Nación, we see traffic is coming largely from Argentina from January to June of 2019. The same can be said of La Tercera, with traffic coming overwhelmingly from Chile. However, both sites feature a dappling of other Hispanic countries and even trans-Hispanic countries, including the United States. If we contrast these with El Boomerang, which is the largest literary site to content in Spanish on the web, what we see is a true mix of countries coming from across the trans-Hispanic web. If we look at traffic sources, we see that La Tercera and La Nación both largely draw traffic from direct sources, which means that users are typing the URLs of these sites into their browsers, rather than necessarily searching for them. Search, however, does make up around 39% for La Tercera and 37% for La Nación. Social media draws about 10% to La Tercera and a little less than half of that to La Nación. This will definitely change in the 21st century as we turn increasingly to social media sources for traffic. However, I did want to highlight here that these two sites really operate as authority sites, which means that users know them so well that they are literally typing their URLs into the search browser. The newspapers that I'll talk about briefly today are large outlets with significant print and digital readerships that extend beyond national publics, as I talked about in the previous slide. Furthermore, and as one would expect of any large newspaper, especially one in a cultural context that favors far-reaching literary consumption, the newspaper's coverage of literature far exceeds national or regional parameters. The arts and letters section has long been an institution in Latin American newspapers. This is a place for authors' work to be shared and to share opinions, for readers to get recommendations, analysis, commentary, and insights. And there are many different forms of literary content in one spot. In this particular slide, I wanted to show you what the July 4th edition of La Nación looked like in the culture section. And of course, it's talking about how both in Argentina and in Latin America broadly, we're reading more and more on electronic devices, something that I'll talk about later in today's presentation. So I've been studying these particular newspapers for quite some time and have done so collecting data, which I've actually put into various Google Sheets, looking at variables including date published, the article's author, the title, the type of article, authors mentioned in the particular article, the national affiliation of those particular authors that are mentioned, a link to the article, and other observations about general themes and trends in these articles. So if these spaces are not dedicated to looking at electronic literature, whether in form or in theme, what exactly are they doing? Well, based on the June 2019 data collection of articles in the literature section on the Culto subdomain of La Tercera, readers observe that most articles are connected to Chile, either directly by author or theme of the article, or they're in some way Pan-American. In other words, They really focus on the Americas, North, South, Central, and the Caribbean. When non-Latin American authors and works are addressed, the content tends towards coverage of European authors featured in a sort of homage format, like the article noting the 70th anniversary of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, George Orwell's 1984, and prize winners of major literary contests like the Nobel Prize and the Manuel Rojas Prize in Latin America with accompanying literary articles. This is also a data subset that is dedicated to global forms of thinking through literature. Indeed, there are a number of significant articles, 7 of 53 in June alone, that are devoted to a series of world literary authors, often of popular significance, especially with folk or counterculture fame. One article recounts the historic connections between Bob Dylan and famous Beat Generation authors such as Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. While Kerouac and Ginsberg did travel to Latin America and wrote about it, the Beat Generation movement is known as a North American avant-garde movement in the 1950s and 1960s mainly. Hunter S. Thompson, author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, makes an appearance among the articles as well, along with Nick Cave, Australian post-punk musician, actor, and author, post-colonial theorist Michel Foucault, and the iconic Japanese author Haruki Murakami. In other words, there's a focus on the reader who would recognize these global names in the same repertoire of counterculture canon. There's also an implication that these authors and figures are often grouped together for the same reader and thus share space on the same platform alongside Latin American literary content. In general terms, Culto presents a mix of global and Latin American content, displaying everything from the highly canonical, such as the abundance of content on Gabriela Mistral, to the highly specialized, including works by minor or peripheral authors with cult followings. So in this particular slide, I'm actually looking at the exact same time frame, so June of 2019, with the exact same variables, and doing a qualitative data mine, or what I would call a medium reading of this particular set of text for La Nación. Compared to La Nación's Literatura section, Culto is a much more expansive and inclusive with countries other than the typical literary and cultural powerhouses. The site strives to appeal to a curious reader who is familiar with Latin American and foreign canonical works, or at least has a curiosity and an openness for discovery. The idea of bringing up literary polemics and controversies between Maria Vargas Llosa and Alejo Compartía, for example, is a way to do a historical recount of the literary canon in a didactic way. If we look at the same time frame for La Nación, so you'll see some of these variables in these articles here, there are definitely convergences, but also some significant deviations in content. Similar to Culto, La Nación celebrated Nobel Prize winners and polemics of Maria Vargas Llosa and others. But La Nación also stresses world literary works and figures while looking into some of the intricacies of canonical works. For example, there's an article on Literatura, so that would be perhaps one form of electronic literature, that both informs the reader about the social mediation of classical texts, while also highlighting the salient themes of these classics and extension of the objectives of literature. Miguel de Cervantes and Margaret Atwood are mentioned, for example. Another article plays a more critical role by connecting Homer and Jorge Luis Borges as literary figures, connecting classics and national history through literature. Another piece, the author entirely dedicates his work to J.B. Ballard, a British author, describing him as a visionary machine. Comparing this small sample from La Nación to Culto section of the non-Latin American canon, it would appear that La Nación is promoting a more traditional notion of the canon rather than a countercultural one. Indeed, La Nación's literary section tends more towards insular or close-knit writers to Argentine traditions and migration patterns. However, when the themes of literature and culture are explored from the perspective of the non-Argentine, they tend to be European with a particular focus on Italy. One final observation is the hinging from the cinematic to the literary sphere, indicative of the cross-media conversations that seem to happen in La Nación. One example of this is an article published in June of 2019 with the headline "Que lee Antonio Banderas en Dolor y Gloria, la última película de Almodóvar." What is Antonio Banderas reading in Dolor y Gloria, the last film by Almodóvar? There are, of course, other examples as well. Many of these authors are linked via book reviews or related articles in an effort to create a sustained readership and inform readers about the hypertextual world literary dialogues that go on in the filmic canon of Almodóvar. There is perhaps no better example to highlight the broader trend of intertextual dialogues between popular culture and high art than in Argentine transnational works presented in La Nación. One argument I like to briefly make in this particular presentation is that we need to rethink genre in online newspapers and look at things like testimonial genre and travel chronicles as potential form of e-literature. Just looking at the titles of some of the e-lit travel chronicles on La Nación, many of them evoke a more creative and subjective take on journalism or literary production. Travel literature and chronicles often are sort of meeting point in these articles between the creative writer and professional journalist. The inclusion of some excerpts of celebrated authors such as Sayer, Ocampo, and Sarmiento and their travel chronicles helps to situate the e-crónica de viaje in the literary realm rather than a necessarily scientific or journalistic endeavor. All of these chronicles include photos as the main feature point, even if the photo is not specifically hosted in that particular place, but it is rather a stock photo. When the photos are given by locals, credit is given and the caption even includes the user's handle on social media. This is an interesting way to bond local perspectives between that of the author's description of the particular place that they're looking at with mass readership from abroad. Comments and likes are also enabled in all these chronicas, which is a common feature of e-lit on blogs and also in online newspapers. These articles are relevant in the time of COVID-19, especially since most tourism and travel for pleasure has also been heavily restricted to domestic travel or even stay-at-home measures. In short, I think that the e-crónica de viaje is probably the closest resemblance to e-literature on La Nación's culture section that may dialogue well with my past research on local and global perspectives, and also provide some future directions for mobility, connectivity, etc. Travel literature and chronicles are historically important in Latin American literature, especially during scientific travel in the 18th and 19th century, as well as the modernist writers, including José Martí, whose eyes and ears abroad penned the sensation of travel and discovery for curious readers in Latin America. Therefore, it's not surprising that traveling e-literature seems to be a popular topic on La Nación and other national newspapers, as it looks at also the privileges of Latin American cultural production before those abroad, at least more in La Tercera than in Culto. I also wanted to briefly mention the idea of looking at the testimonial genre in these particular platforms. So the question is this a type of e-literature? So maybe if we consider the testimonial literature to be literature, maybe there's an e-literature genre here that's perhaps an e-testimony of sorts. I'm giving an example here of the Voces section of La Tercera. Again, like the Crónica de Viaje in the 19th century, testimonial literature is a key component of the 20th century Latin American literary production that gave space to the voces or voices from the margins. And perhaps this is a way of rethinking genre. This is one of the most important genres that rides the lines of journalism and this more creative and subjective ways to look at digital literary production and production that has a creative spirit. If we consider the third generation of electronic literature as proposed by my co-panelist Leonardo Flores, we see, of course, here also a shift towards visual. If we look at the July 5th edition of Culto, what we can see here, if we look at the tab bar, we see series, music, books, películas or films, history, recipes, and Netflix. Netflix actually pays a pretty significant part of the volume of content on Culto, as Chileans are ever self-quarantining during the era of COVID-19. We also see the ability to connect with content over Twitter, over Facebook, over Instagram, and Spotify. I would argue that it is our work as scholars of digital media and e-literature as a genre to rethink what it means to produce culture in a digital era. Sharing, collaborating, remediating, tagging, reposting, and other forms of what Carolina Gansa would call culture hacking are important for understanding what it means to produce literature or other forms of culture online. This is particularly the case as we enter into the second decade of the 21st century, and even more so the case in the era of COVID-19. Although I haven't had the opportunity to look at the traffic data from Culto or La Nación in the last few days here, I would not be surprised if social media did draw more traffic to these sites than it did in the past when I showed you from 2019. More than anything, what we can see in these particular sites is a number of contradictions. So to go back to some of the original questions of today's talk, how do we explain the dearth of e-lit in national newspapers? And national newspapers tend to really kind of cling to some more traditional forms of literary writing, as we can see in both cases. This means looking at canonical writing, writers that are generally within canonical frameworks, both in Latin America and abroad, or literary writers that are recognizable, and ways of attracting the readership from writers, topics, and themes that really are rather traditional in their general undertaking. However, we do see a number of contradictions. We see countercultural topics. We see those that are sort of emerging outside the spaces of national parameters. And we really do see different forms and modes of receiving culture, as I talked about in the last slide. Additionally, if we expand what it means to kind of write e-lit and look at different types of genres, including the testimonial genre, including perhaps crónicas de viaje or e-travel logs, these could be other ways of exploring what it means to write creatively in the spaces of national newspapers. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about writerly intention. If someone envisions their work will only ever be read on a screen, a computer, a tablet, a phone, an e-reader, etc., does this necessarily make them a writer of electronic literature? Writers are increasingly turning to digital platforms for distribution of literary texts in our current era. What happens when digitally born literature is the primary mode of production in an era when analog distribution is a logistical impossibility? Rather than answering these particular questions, I'd like to leave these for you all to think about as I wrap up my talk today. Will everyone become a writer of e-lit if they're writing literature on a screen that they assume will only ever be read on a screen? I think leaving this with an open-ended question or set of questions is perhaps the best thing to do in an era of continued mystery and continued dynamic change. Thank you so much.